both sides would certainly suffer. And I think we'd be talking about a contribution to a global recession if that happened.
Well, joining us now is historian, political scientist, and China expert Rana Mitter. Good morning to you.
Hello, Esma. Hi.
Is it as easy to say, as Victor Gao said, Taiwan is part of China, when both America and the UK have quite an ambiguous position towards its status?
Well, since 1949, when there was a civil war which ended with the communist victory of Chairman Mao on the mainland and the Chiang Kai-shek nationalists on the island, there's essentially been a sort of diplomatic norm that's been maintained that most other countries agree that there is one China in the world. They're a bit ambiguous about which China it is, whether, in other words, it's the so-called Republic of China on the island of Taiwan or the People's Republic of China, which, of course, is recognized by the vast majority of countries. They've never actually gone as far as saying that Beijing's position is recognized by Washington. It's more that, as they put it, they acknowledge it. That's a slightly different phrasing.
I mean, obviously, to people who are coming at this from with 2022 eyes, that seems like a ridiculous policy. Perhaps, though, it's the only diplomatic kind of solution, the only diplomatic mode of operating. But the problem with ambiguity, and when different people understand different things and they're not really saying what they think and not really saying what they mean, is that countries like China can capitalize on that.
Well, essentially, over the last, a bit have to go back up, 70 years, but just say 30 years to the early 1990s, although the position was the same, it's even sometimes known in China as the 1992 consensus, that basically everyone stays in a frozen status quo. The world was very different. In the early 90s, the United States was still the most powerful country in the world, bar none. China was still relatively inward looking, not very keen to make international moves. Now, under President Xi Jinping, we've got a China that is very, very keen to assert all of its historical rights and basically give a maximal interpretation of where its territory is, both by land and sea. So in some senses, the official position hasn't changed, but the willingness of the mainland to actually use its military, economic, and cyber capacity has really expanded.
What do you think China wants to do? What is the end game for it? Do they want to absorb Taiwan, and when might that happen? And how much, if they did make overtures to actually do that, what do you think the global response to that would be?
The aim is essentially to put Taiwan under the official sovereignty of the People's Republic of China one way or another. I think there would be some attempt to claim that Taiwan's system would be reserved in some form, a sort of rather like Hong Kong, which, of course, as you know, technically is different from the mainland of China, but has had a lot of its freedoms restricted. But I think the reaction of the rest of the world, if it happened through military means as opposed to peaceful means, would be very severe. We're talking about sanctions, probably economic sanctions, rather than an immediate military strike. But if you think about the way that, on the one hand, China is linked into every single economy in the Asia Pacific region and beyond. But also, of course, China is dependent on things like semiconductor computer chips from Taiwan. Both sides would certainly suffer. And I think we'd be talking about a contribution to a global recession if that happened.
Well, absolutely. How could it happen by peaceful means, though? Because the people of Taiwan are pretty clear about how they see themselves.
It's a very, very difficult diplomatic dilemma at the moment. A few decades ago, it might have been possible to say that there was a sort of Hong Kong style compromise. But since essentially Hong Kong's freedoms have been taken away under the national security law, most people in Taiwan don't really trust Beijing. I think probably the only likelihood, and it's a very remote one in some ways, is some kind of overarching framework in which technically sovereignty is shared, but every part of China, including Taiwan, basically gets to run itself domestically as it wants to do. But that demands a tremendous amount of very careful diplomacy, international goodwill, and also China to have a much more flexible attitude to what sovereignty means than it's doing right now.
Are you concerned about this? The UK National Security Advisor warned that we are one misunderstanding away from accidental nuclear war with China. Do you think that's overstating it?
There are clear dangers. I mean, it's certainly a more dangerous situation than it was even, let's say, five years ago. Nuclear war, I think, obviously it's technically possible, but a last resort. But I think looking at a really brutal conventional war of the type, we're seeing in Eastern Europe at the moment, with missiles, with submarines, with basically the most economically dynamic area in the world, essentially having, a missile fired through it, that would be a tremendously damaging thing, both in terms of the horror caused to human life, but also the sputtering world economy, not in the best state in the world at the moment. This would be a really damaging element to that.
Yes. Rana, thank you so much, as usual. Rana Mitter, historian, political scientist, and China expert.